Hi, and welcome back to Frankie Sense and More for another month of our Movies with Meaning reviews. I'm your guest host, Ishita, and I am, as always, honored and thrilled to be here with our in-house movie critic, Brent Marchant. Brent Marchant is a film critic. He's also the author of 3 books. And to read his beautiful movie reviews, please go on and check out his website at brentmarchant.com. So, hi, Brent. How are you doing today?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm good too. Thank you. So, looking forward to a bunch of new movies that we've got here for April.
We've got some really interesting choices this month. We got 6 new movies to take a look at, and let's have at it. So, our first film is currently playing in theaters. It's very popular, called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. This is a really interesting movie to try and describe. It's kind of a manic comedy, drama, science fiction offering that gets into some very interesting and fairly heady topics involving philosophy, metaphysics, morality, and it's kind of unusual thinking of it coming in a comedy setting as it does here. Basically, it tells a story of this woman named Evelyn Wang. She's the beleaguered owner of a laundromat. And as the title implies, she's being hit by everything from everywhere all at once. And it's a lot. She's got a very full plate. She's not terribly happy with her husband, looking to divorce him because he's kind of a milquetoast. She's grown rather tired of that. She's dealing with her daughter, who has developed a relationship with a woman, and she's not quite sure how she feels about her daughter's lesbian lifestyle, so she's working with that. Then she's dealing with the recent arrival of her father, who's an aging, high-maintenance senior named Gong Gong. And then on top of that, she's trying to run the business and plan a Chinese New Year's party. But most of all, she's also getting ready to deal with a tax audit from the Internal Revenue Service.
Wow.
She's being put up. It really is a lot going on all at once. And she's had the assignment. The audit's been assigned to a very hard-nosed, tough as nails agent named Deidre, played Beastly by Jamie Lee Curtis. She's just really funny in the part.
Mm.
But if all of that weren't enough, while she's in the elevator on the way up to the tax office, she begins having visions, hallucinations, out-of-body experiences that just seem to come from out of nowhere. She doesn't know what to do about them. She doesn't know what they mean. And she's approached in one of them by somebody who claims to be an alternate version of her husband. And he says, "I've been looking for you for ages. I need your help." And she said, "What do you mean, this version of me?" And he said, "Well, that's how things operate in the multiverse." And she's, "What's the multiverse?" And essentially, he explains that the multiverse is the collection of all of the different possible universes that can exist taken as a whole. And if that sounds kind of strange, he then adds that each of us has a version of ourselves that exists in each of these different universes, possessing different qualities, traits, talents, abilities. And he says that he's been looking for this version of her in particular because she has the skills that the multiverse needs to help thwart a growing evil that threatens its existence. She said, "What do you mean I have the skills? I have no idea what you're talking about." Well, that's what launches her into this incredible odyssey of what this film is all about. It's designed to explain what the multiverse is, what our alternate selves are, and what we can learn by interacting with these other aspects of ourselves, these different counterparts, to take on different challenges that we have in what would best be called our home universe. But in this case, he's actually saying that she will be not only taking on the challenge in the home universe, but in the multiverse as a whole. And of course, she has no idea what he's talking about. So then she goes into this very long and complicated trial by error process filled with lots of wonderful humor, learning about what she's supposed to do and how she's supposed to do it. The film is loaded with big laughs. It's loaded with takeoffs on a variety of other movies, particularly martial arts films.
Oh,
It just has a really wonderful quality about it in terms of explaining these rather esoteric and complicated subjects in a very funny way.
that's nice, because usually like sci-fi movies, like you said, they're not ones to be mixed in with like comedy genres. So they stand out. So I think as somebody who doesn't like, I'm not very well versed with sci-fi either. So that sounds like a fun watch and a good way to get into the genre without having too much being thrown at you.
Well, that's actually, you hit the nail on the head though, where the film does run into one of its problems, where it does hit you with an awful lot. And that, unfortunately, I think is one of the things that kind of undermines the success of the film, is that it throws so much at you. I mean, just visually alone, it's like an assault on your senses. But when you take collectively that with all of the material that it's including, it does get to be a lot to take in. And at a fairly long runtime, it's almost 2.5 hours long.
Oh wow, that's long. Yeah.
That is a lot to take in. I think that they really could have cut it by about a half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
They could have taken out some of the material. It seems like they're almost trying to convey too much.
Yeah.
And some of the bits, particularly like the martial art movie takeoffs, they go on a little too long and a little too frequently. There's an expression in the movie industry called knowing when to kill your darlings.
Uh-huh.
Basically, when directors have things that they might really like, but leaving them in is not for the good of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Then they run themselves into problems with how it's going to be conveyed to the viewer. And it's at that point when they have to, as the phrase suggests, kill their darlings, kill off the parts that they like themselves as much as they do for the good of the film. The directors here didn't really do that.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this gets into trouble. Now, one thing that this film did remind me of is it reminded me a lot of a film that we reviewed earlier on an earlier episode called Strawberry Mansion, which was also kind of a sci-fi metaphysical comedy. And I like that because it pared things down to a more manageable level. And that's where Everything Everywhere All at Once, ironically, given its title, gets itself into trouble.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
You mentioned like so many different plot lines at the beginning. I can't imagine how all of those would have panned out, plus the multiverse, which is such a huge concept in itself.
exactly. I mean, each of the individual storylines that Evelyn is dealing with does get played out in the film. There is this situation with her husband. There is a situation with her daughter and her lover. There's a situation with her father. The Chinese New Year's party, the IRS audit. I mean, each one of these individually is constituting a lot of material in and of itself.
Yeah.
When you take that and you put it in the context of how does that fit into the story of the multiverse, it just kind of grows exponentially. And it's a lot to handle. It's a lot to take in. And that's where I think the directors, their names are Dan Kwan and Daniel Scheinert. They go by the nickname the Daniels. That's where the Daniels really needed to kind of step in and rein in their material to keep it from getting out of hand. And that's exactly what happens to this film to a certain degree. So while I recommend that people see it, because I think it's important to understand this concept of multidimensionality and how it could benefit each of us, because there are a lot of times when each of us think to ourselves that we're greater than the sum of our parts. And that can help us out in, times of crisis, times of extreme stress, to do things that we didn't think we were capable of.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important for us to learn. And this movie does a good job of helping to explain that.
Yeah.
But then you got everything else thrown in on top of it. And that's where it gets kind of bogged down. So I'm giving this one kind of a conditional recommendation.
Okay.
It's worth seeing, but understand you're going to have to kind of do some sifting as you're watching it.
Right.
to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to set this aside because it's not as important as the other things. But the things that do matter, it does a good job of explaining and illustrating. And that's the takeaway, I think, from the film that viewers should get from it. Not to mention getting a lot of laughs out of it, too.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, Brent, how much would you give this one?
I would give this one probably 3 out of 5. If it had been a little bit better edited, I probably would have given it a higher mark.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that I believe detracts from the overall quality, and that really should have been reconsidered before the film was released. It does have some great performances. As I said, Jamie Lee Curtis is just phenomenal, as is Michelle Yeoh, who plays the lead role, and also Ke Huy Quan, who plays Evelyn's husband. He's probably best known as the actor who played the little boy many, many, many moons ago in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. He's all grown up now.
Oh, wow.
So it's very interesting when you think of having seen him and known him as just being this little kid all these years, now seeing him as an adult is interesting. And he's good in the fact that he's essentially playing several versions of the same character. He's playing Evelyn's milquetoast husband, and at the same time, he's also playing this adventurer and explorer from a different universe who's looking to find Evelyn to take on the task at hand of saving it.
Wow, that's just complicating things further. But
exactly.
Yeah, it makes me curious though about how it's put forth for viewers to watch. So I don't know, maybe if I get my hands on it, I'd like to give it a try just out of curiosity.
It's done very well in theaters. I mean, I think at some point it will definitely be available more widely. Although the one thing I do recommend, it is probably best seen on as big a screen as possible, simply because the special effects are so dazzling that you'll really want to be taken in, by the visual feast by having it on a big screen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, Brent. Let's move on to our next movie.
Okay, so our next film is a film that was a documentary feature nominee at the most recent Oscar ceremony called Writing with Fire. And this is a film from India that tells the story of a news organization called Khabar Lahariya, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, based out of Uttar Pradesh, that's run entirely by women who are members of the Dalit caste. And it tells the story of how they basically started from scratch in building a news media organization, beginning initially with print and then eventually going to electronics, to help get stories out that they felt weren't being adequately covered in the mainstream press. They were taking on subjects like government corruption and ineptitude, illegal mining, violence against women, inadequate healthcare, political extremism. And even though they started out small, they've grown to be quite large regionally, and are also even being considered a national force now in reporting the news. Something that's unusual given the fact that it's run entirely by women in an industry that tends to be very male dominated. It's run by people who had not a lot of formal training, but who are very diligent in terms of going after their stories, covering them fully, making sure that the word gets out, and filling a need that was going unfilled previously. The film, this documentary, follows them in how they go about the process of gathering the news. In many cases, even going into very dangerous situations. But they go ahead and approach it fearlessly and basically have developed quite a following as a result of their investigative reporting. They now have a YouTube channel that boasts 150 million viewers on a regular basis. And the organization is getting ready to, I believe, start up bureaus all throughout India, and is even getting recognition internationally, not just because of this film, but also because of the intrepid reporting that they have been doing. They've made quite a name for themselves, and it's interesting to see just how diligent these reporters are, who really did not have a lot of formal training and background in this material. Mm-hmm. The film is really quite compelling. I really enjoyed watching it. It was very deserving of its Oscar nomination for Best Documentary Feature. The one thing I would advise viewers to be aware of is, depending upon which streaming source you get it from, you may experience some sound quality issues in watching the film. I don't know if that's true across the board with all the streaming platforms. I know it was with the one that I watched. Thank goodness for subtitles, because they at least, made sure that you could get the message conveyed with what was being said, even if you couldn't necessarily always hear it as clearly as you could have. So this is a very inspiring film, something that is really, I think, important these days, given the fact that so many people have become mistrustful of the mainstream media. Right. To see that there are still organizations out there that are committed to getting the truth, to being credible, to being thorough, and to being objective. And those are qualities that have unfortunately really vanished from a lot of mainstream journalism. Having been trained as a journalist myself, it's something that I often look at quite sadly in many ways to see how it's changed over the years. But they are sticking to their guns. They're going forward with this, and I salute them for every bit that they're doing.
Wow, that really sounds incredible. And I think there's so many things which are relevant to India today. I wanted to watch this film as well. Like you said, the news, there's like a lot of fake news and a lot of you can't trust where you're getting your news from. So that's a huge problem in India. And also the fact that not only were they women, but also from a caste, and that is usually looked down upon. And that's like a huge thing in India, because the caste systems unfortunately overrule a lot of these areas. So sounds incredible. And I think that's really inspiring work as well.
Yeah, they made a point of mentioning the caste system issue, and the fact that even though it's illegal to discriminate based on the caste system, that doesn't change the fact that it still exists in a de facto form. Yeah. And that, this is one of the additional uphill battles that they've had in doing their work. They also seem to be facing it somewhat with regard to their latest undertaking, which is the coverage of political extremism on the right. Something where they have been really challenged in terms of being able to get out and get the story just by virtue of the fact that they're women, just by virtue of the fact that they're from this caste. Yeah. But that doesn't stop them. They again, as I said before, they are very determined to stick to their guns and go and get the story, regardless of what people may try to say about them or whatever qualities they may try to impose upon them. Right. They don't let that be a stumbling block.
No. Yeah, I mean, given that they are so successful today, I hope that this can be an example for other people and organizations as well. Maybe
and the other thing too is that, particularly with the political extremism issue, this is something that's not restricted just to India. This is going on in countries all around the world. Yeah. And they have sort of set a standard in terms of the way they're trying to cover it to inspire media outlets in other countries, particularly those that may be considered alternative or run by sources that wouldn't necessarily be considered part of the mainstream media. They're trying to set an example, not just for what's going on within their own country, but around the globe. And that's really an impressive undertaking. It's not an easy one either, but I think that they feel it's important enough that this news get out in not just their country, but in countries elsewhere, so that people can see what's really going on and not be taken in by it.
Right. So how much would you rate this one, Brent?
I would give this one 3.5 to 4 stars.
Oh.
It was very deserving in terms of its Oscar nomination. It was interesting because 2021 was a very good year for documentaries. And when the nominations came out, I had not heard a word about this film until I saw its name on the nominee list. I thought, what's that? I mean, where did this come from? But it managed to rise to the surface, and deservedly so. And it's also, in addition to being available from streaming sources, it was also featured as one of the elements on the public television series Independent Lens, which I believe it's still available for streaming for free from there, at least for about, I think, another week. So if you don't get a chance to see it on a streaming service, you can, if you're in the US, you can try going to the PBS website and looking up Independent Lens, and then looking up the film title on their site.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, you said 3.5 to 4 stars. So 3.5 is slightly maybe on the lower side. Like I expected that you might be rating this one higher because you didn't point out any major flaws. So is there anything that you didn't?
Well, the one thing is I'm not really sure what the sound quality issue was, and that might have just been the streaming service that I got it from, where that was the issue.
Yeah.
If it wasn't just limited to there, then it was kind of unfortunate that this could potentially be a bigger issue. That's something I was not able to find out anything further about before reviewing it. So that's probably why I'm hedging my bets just a little bit on that. If I'm wrong, and I could very well be, that it might be fine everywhere else, and then it would definitely go up to the higher range of 4.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Brent. Let's move on to our next film for today.
Okay, so the next film that we have is a movie from Brazil. It's the debut feature from a director named Yuli Jabasi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's called The Pink Cloud. And now this is a really prophetic film. It was written in 2017. It was filmed in 2019, and it was released last year. It tells the story of a world in which the sudden appearance of these beautiful pink clouds around the globe proves deadly. They contain what appear to be toxic gases that kill people after very brief exposures. It forces everyone to go inside to stay alive. And basically, when you see them in this new form of isolation or quarantine, you see an awful lot of parallels to things that took place over the past couple of years.
Right.
And I find that so ironic and uncanny, given the fact that this was written and filmed before COVID ever took place.
Yeah, a few years back, actually. And the fact that like everybody in the world went through the pandemic, like that just makes it so relatable for like all the viewers out there.
Exactly. And the fact that in this film, it happens to everybody around the globe as well. And everybody's in the same boat, faced with the same conditions. I mean, even though this is a Brazilian film, you see scenes are film. They feature segments from like news broadcasts from around the globe where everybody has been impacted by this. The one difference is the fact that the influence of the pink cloud here goes on a lot longer than COVID did. It's something that goes on for the long term. So when you talk about the development of a new normal, this really takes the idea to quite a higher degree than anything we experienced going through COVID. You have issues with having to face, how do you keep yourself alive? How do you keep yourself from not going crazy? How do you keep yourself from not wanting to get on each other's nerves? Because it happens so quickly and so fast, and because it kills so quickly, people in the film were trapped almost from the moment that they appeared, and they had to stay inside to keep themselves from being killed. So you have people in places like supermarkets and university buildings where they're holed up because they simply just can't leave to go outside. The film in particular focuses on a couple who met the night before the clouds appeared. They were at a bar and they struck up an attraction toward one another. They had a one night stand together, and in the morning, as they're just sort of lounging around for the morning after, that's when the clouds appear.
Oh,
So these two people who don't know each other at all are suddenly thrust together into long-term, full-time isolation together.
wow, that's an interesting perspective to show the situation from.
Exactly. So you're having them not only having to deal with the issue of the cloud and how to stay alive, but also getting to know one another,
Right.
building a life together. And essentially, they're placed in a position where they're starting from scratch with building a new normal for themselves, not only because of the cloud, but also because of the relationship with one another.
Oh, you said build a new life together. It was that long? Like it lasted for years?
Years. It went, yeah, that's why I said it goes on. Their isolation and quarantine in this film makes what we had to endure with COVID pale by comparison. I mean,
Yeah.
it really, and that's the thing, that they're constantly wondering, like, why is this taking so long to go away?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing is, when you look at this movie on a deeper level, it's interesting in the fact that it raises questions that aren't necessarily directly related to having to figure out how to survive a toxic cloud. By being locked up together as they were, they had to learn how to develop a new normal. And in developing a new normal, they had to decide, how do I want to approach this? What's my outlook going to be on this? What's my overall perspective going to be? Is the glass going to be half empty or half full?
Mm-hmm.
For example, you could go on bemoaning everything that you don't have, or at the same time, you can also be thankful and grateful for the fact that you've got protection. There are ways in which the government has managed to figure out how to supply food and supplies to people. So are you really going to, look at those things and say, well, it's not enough because I can't go outside?
Yeah.
So in a way, you have lessons in appreciation and gratitude also working their way into the story.
Right.
And that's something I think that maybe we didn't really take to heart as fully as we could have during COVID.
Yeah.
And people were saying, well, how come I can't go back out to the club? Or how come I can't go back to the movies or the restaurant? Well, at least you're indoors and safe, and you've got food, and you don't have to worry about your basic everyday survival if you're taking the proper precautions.
Right.
Where is the gratitude or lack thereof in a situation like that? And that's something this film goes into in fairly great depth. The fact that the cloud is pink, I think, is interesting also because everything looks so pretty. This beautiful, beautiful clouds, these beautiful pink clouds look like what you would see at sunset. They're gorgeous to look at.
So ironic.
Yeah, and just in terms of the way the colors are treated in this film, the art direction is just stunning in terms of the visual appeal that is going on with this film.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot of ironies that are working into this story as well.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, this was it was the debut feature from this director, and I really look forward to what she has to produce going forward, because this is a great start for feature film work. This primarily played the film festival circuit initially, but it's been very well received and is now available for streaming from multiple sources. So it's certainly one that I think is worth checking out. It will probably touch you in a sort of ironic way, given, again, how much the movie has actually paralleled what happened in real life, and given the fact that it came about before real life itself took place.
Right. That's crazy. And I think that we would all be able to relate to the gratitude part as well. Although we didn't experience so much of it because I think our pandemic was not as extreme. But like we should all be thankful for what we had compared to what was going on in the film. Do they give any explanation for the nature of those pink clouds or how they came or what they are?
Not really, no. But the one thing that I was thinking is, given the fact that it was ultimately kind of calling the question regarding appreciation and gratitude, I couldn't help but be struck by the notion that this may have been almost like a form of divine intervention in some ways, forcing the issue of tough love on people, saying, I want you to learn gratitude and appreciation in a way that maybe you weren't able to learn it any other way.
Yeah.
And how will you respond to it? Will you indeed rise to the challenge and say, yes, I'm thankful for what I have? Or will you wallow in self-pity and say, why can't I go out to the club again tonight? That kind of thing.
Right.
So that's that part of the story is kind of left openly ambiguous, which is fine, because I think it really causes viewers then to have to sit down and think about, why did this happen? Why is this going on? What's the message? What's the lesson in this? And it's interesting in the fact that a sci-fi film can do that. I'm always very impressed when a science fiction movie takes itself to a deeper level than just showing dazzling special effects going on around you. And that's certainly what is done here. And I really was very impressed with it.
So how much would you rate this?
I would give this a 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend this one quite highly.
Okay.
It does have some pacing issues as it goes on. I will admit that it does get to be a little stretched out. Some of the material gets to be a little bit repetitive in terms of the issues that kind of keep coming up again.
Yeah.
But then again, when you're faced with circumstances like that it's probably completely unavoidable as well.
Right.
So it's sort of a natural outgrowth or a natural tendency to be associated with that in a story like this. So I can kind of forgive that a little more easily than I might otherwise, but it may try the patience of some viewers a little bit, but I think given everything else it has to offer, it's worth putting up with a little bit of tedium at points, just so you can get everything else that goes with it.
Great, Brent. Thank you. Let's move on to our next movie.
Okay, our next movie is a film that has played the film festival circuit recently. Is now available for streaming. It's a film that comes out of Slovakia called Servants. And Servants is a film that's set in a seminary in Bratislava, Slovakia, at that point Czechoslovakia, in 1980, following the communist crackdown that came several years before that, where there were attempts made within the country to try and increase freedom and progressive ideas. And one place in particular where that happened a lot was in seminaries. Because the government begrudgingly allowed religious institutions like that to continue to exist, which theoretically should not have been the case under a communist rule. It was a case where people could turn to the church as a source of solace and comfort under those kinds of conditions. Unfortunately, the government, particularly the secret police, were very much against the idea of seminaries and other religious institutions from spreading ideas that might give people ideas of self-empowerment and things like that. They would squelch all of that. And in the case of a seminary where you have students learning about these issues, that was one place where they wanted to make sure that they made a big effort to stop it in its tracks before it got out of hand. Yet you have these seminary students who are very young and idealistic in many ways, and felt that if they were going to be true to their faith and true to their calling, they would have to do what they thought was necessary to spread the teachings of Christ, particularly in a society that was desperately in need and want of those kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
So you had this very tense situation set up between the seminarians and the secret police who were watching their every move. Interestingly enough, you would think that a setting like this wouldn't necessarily lend itself to a lot of tension, but because of those kinds of conditions, it fits into the story perfectly. This is a film that has a very, what I would call, edge of your seat quality to it that you wouldn't necessarily expect coming out of a narrative or a setting like this. You know, you see these students saying, are they going to be able to do what they want to do? Secret police are coming along and saying, we're not going to let you do what you want to do. But how far are they going to go? At the same time, they also have the secret police putting a lot of pressure on the people who are running the seminary, the dean, the teachers, saying, you have to make sure that you keep your students in line. Of course, they are often of the same mindset as the students themselves, so it's hard for them to have to keep themselves from biting their tongue. And also, they're walking a very fine line in terms of being able to say what they want to say, but also be able to keep the seminary open, because the secret police has said, if you don't cooperate, we're going to shut you down. It's a very tense situation that's playing throughout this film. A lot of very interesting dynamics taking place in a setting that you would think would ordinarily be immune from that, or would be very quiet, contemplative, meditative, but that just doesn't happen. The other thing I liked about this film is the cinematography is positively stunning. It's shot in black and white, and every scene is just, it's framed perfectly.
Wow.
All the elements within the film, it's within each scene, which I believe the French refer to as mise en scène. Everything is placed perfectly in terms of the people, the props. It's like watching a series of moving paintings and not just watching a film.
Wow.
It's that gorgeous. I mean, it really is just absolutely stunning. And it's, to me, I mean, I thought the film was worth the price of admission just to see how well this film was put together as a production. But when you add to that all the other things it has going for it, the tension created within the story, and the question of ideas being properly played out, especially when it comes to the title servants, because both of the opposing parties in this film are trying to serve their causes. You have the priests and the seminary students trying to serve their religious and spiritual mission. At the same time that you have the secret police fulfilling their mission of being loyal to the state. However, it's interesting for them in the fact that they know that even though they're being loyal to what they're being dictated to do, it's not right. And it's taking quite a toll on them as individuals. One character in particular, with the lead secret police individual, has started developing severe dermatological issues as a result of what he's doing. It's almost like his boundaries between him and the state have become violated, and it's eating him away as he's trying to deal with this situation. So again, this is a movie that goes into it. It goes into deeper levels than just its initial, its initial narrative goals and objectives. I was just captivated by this film. I mean, it was. Some people might look at it as being a little bit slow moving, but just the level of tension that's created in the story, to me, was so gripping enough that I was glued to the screen while I was watching it. Yeah. I saw it at a film festival, and I'm really glad to see that it's available for streaming now, because it's quite a good film. I recommend it highly, especially for anybody who really wants to give thought to the ideas of what it means to serve, what it means to be devoted to your calling, to being honest and operating from integrity for oneself. This film goes into that in pretty great detail and really drives their points home. So I recommend this one very highly.
That sounds really interesting. I'll say when you started off, and in fact, even in the review that I read, it was a setting and like a time that I couldn't really relate to, especially with the religious ideas. But the tension part of it, like the actual plot, really sounds interesting. That combined with the cinematography, like you mentioned, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily have to be an overly religious or spiritual person to appreciate what these characters are going through in this story. It really has to do with ideas of being true to oneself.
True,
and
yeah.
being true to one's beliefs. Mm-hmm. And how effectively can you do that, particularly when you're faced with forces that are trying to take those things away from you. They're trying to impose their will on you, their view of the world, which, I mean, if you're a spiritual person and you're dealing with a totalitarian government, those things don't exactly line up very easily or readily. And having to operate under those conditions. I mean, in many ways, it's almost a throwback to some of the days of early Christianity, where some of the things that they try to do, they almost have to do them in secret to keep, the opposing forces from overwhelming them or trying to do them in.
Yeah.
So it's a really compelling story from the standpoint of getting you to understand the lengths that people will go to be honest with themselves and their beliefs and their convictions.
Oh, so how much would you rate that one?
I would give this one a 4, maybe even a 4.5, just on virtue of the look, because again, I was really just very impressed with the imagery and the way this movie was filmed.
Wow, that sounds great, and yeah, definitely put it on my watch list.
It's not a terribly long movie. I believe it was only like about an hour and 20 minutes. Oh, so so even though I think that was probably to its benefit, because given the fact that the pacing is a little bit on the slow side, if it had gone out a lot longer, it might have really tried viewers' patience. But it was seen to be like just the right length for the material and the pacing that's involved. The other thing with the pacing being a little bit on the slow side, I think it's important to recognize, is the fact that these conditions were something that the people at the time had to live with, the oppression that they were facing from a totalitarian government being hanging over them all the time, relentlessly. They couldn't get away from it. They couldn't escape it. And because of that, I think that the pacing helps to kind of reinforce that idea. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that it's coming in the face of these people who were in the seminary, given the fact that religion and spirituality was sort of seen as the one outlet that they had for being able to kind of loosen up somewhat. Right. But the thing is, the totalitarian government didn't even want them to be able to do it under those circumstances. They wanted to keep them under the thumb at all times, even in a place that's supposedly the one kind of escape that they have from that. So again, I think it was a very well thought out film and really very well put together. This was the second feature from a director named Ivan Ostrochovsky. And again, I'm looking forward to see what he has to come out with in the future, because this was a terrific offering.
Wow, thank you, Brent. Let's move on to our next film.
Okay, so our next film is a movie that was it was delayed in its release for a while because of COVID, but it's finally out now. It's available for streaming. It's called Minamata. And this is a fact-based story that tells about a World War II photojournalist, widely acclaimed, did a lot of work for Life magazine, named Eugene Smith. He had developed quite a reputation for his work during World War II, covering the war in Japan. And he was kind of known to become the father of the modern photo essay. Unfortunately, in the years after the war, life was not terribly kind to him. Some of his projects did not turn out well. He was estranged from his family. He was financially destitute. And by the early 70s, he was not really sure exactly how much longer he was going to be around, because he was also now addicted to alcohol and amphetamines. So it was really wearing on his health. Interestingly, though, he ended up having a chance meeting with a woman named Aileen Miyoko, who sort of found her way to him under a ruse to get his attention. She was aware of his work. She was aware of the quality of what he could do for storytelling, for conveying ideas. And what she was trying to do was to get him to cover a story. It was unfolding in Japan in a fishing village called Minamata, where the water was systematically being poisoned by a company that was dumping mercury into the water supply. It was causing all kinds of problems with the health of the people. It had been going on for about 15 years, and there was very little coverage of it. Mm-hmm. She felt that he needed to come in and document what was going on and make the world more aware of it so that people would do something about it. Yeah. He was initially very reluctant to do it, but she made a convincing enough pitch to him that he said, yes, I need to go ahead and do this. Mm-hmm. He approached Life magazine, which he had worked for years, and said, please, will you bankroll me on this so I can go ahead and do this photo shoot and do this story? And they were a little reluctant to it because he had become somewhat unreliable given the state that he was in with his addictions and his work ethic and so forth. So they reluctantly agreed, and they sent him to Japan, and then he got to work documenting the story, and it really touched him in terms of seeing what this systematic poisoning of the water had done to the people, especially since the company that was responsible for it was essentially getting away with it scot-free almost. Yeah. The company was very much in cahoots with the government, so they were able to get, a pass on a lot of this stuff. They managed to get media coverage squelched for the most part, so very little word of this was getting out. Smith, for his part, would have no part of this. They tried bribing him, they tried intimidating him, they did everything to try and silence him, but he kept going forward and documenting what he was seeing. And when the results were published, it shocked the world. And it helped to bring about some changes in terms of the way this was all playing out for the people in this village. Right. It was an act of redemption for the photographer, given the way things had been going in his life. It was a way of him being able to give back, given the fact that he had become rather self-centered and selfish in recent years. Now he was able to do something that really could have an impact. Yeah. And it really, was a very inspiring and stirring story. The film is a little bit preachy at times and a little bit heavy-handed in its treatment of the subject, which, I suppose in some ways you can't really underplay these kinds of issues, but you can also be come out a little too strong. So that was my one complaint with the film, is the fact that it was touching, and it was, motivating in terms of getting people to be aware of these kinds of problems that have been occurring around the globe. But I think it could have dialed down, the approach a little bit in the way it was presenting it. Right. One of the things I did like about this film is that the lead role was played by Johnny Depp, who's not had a lot of really great success with recent movies. This is some of the best work he has done in years. It's a really great performance. It's interesting to see him do something that's not quite as off the wall as some of his other characters have been in recent years. And it's also interesting to see him playing a character who is more mature in terms of not just attitudes, but also in terms of just in terms of age.
Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of like, Johnny Depp doing like one of his first, senior roles in many ways.
Yeah.
And he does a great job. He really does. This is a fine performance in a good film, and one that I think is really important for people to see in light of a lot of the ecological tragedies that are going on around the world. That's something that the film also highlights in the closing credits, is that in addition to Minamata, it shows still photos over the credits of other environmental and ecological disasters that have occurred around the world over the years.
Wow.
And, it's when you see them compiled into a montage, you almost kind of forget that all of them happened. You remember them individually, but you don't necessarily think of them collectively.
Yeah.
And this film really does a good job in that regard of reminding you just how prevalent these kinds of issues are and how important it is to address them. The earth is our home. It's our only home.
Yeah.
And we really had better take better care of it if we want to be able to continue to call it our home.
Yeah, that's ironic because just today I was reading the news about how they've predicted that there's going to be a lot more natural disasters, or this case is like man-made disasters, but related to nature because of the kind of neglect that we have towards the planet. One thing that I'm really curious about though is that I think you said that the organization was able to get away with this for like 15 years, right?
Yeah, the poisoning started in around 1956. That's when the first cases of the disease started showing up.
Oh.
And this story is set in 1971. And during that time, there was very, very little coverage of it. I mean, almost nobody had heard of it, even in Japan. The coverage of it had been squelched so heavily that reports of it just were not getting out. I mean, the kind of interesting thing about that is that something similar is going on in Japan these days with regard to the tragedy that took place at the Fukushima nuclear plant after the tsunami and earthquake back in 2011, I believe it was.
Right.
Last I had heard, it is illegal and can lead to imprisonment in Japan if any journalists attempt to report about what's been going on with Fukushima in the time since then. Yes. And that kind of pressure was being put on journalists about Minamata back from the 50s to the 70s until Smith came along and did this photo essay for Life magazine.
Yeah, that's just what I was wondering, that Smith would have faced some real obstacles in getting there, right? Given how heavily coverage on that was suppressed all along.
Yeah, I mean, he was they had a dark room that was created for him to develop his film over there, and mysteriously it caught fire. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of his work was just destroyed in that one instant with the fire breaking out. And like I say, they had tried bribing him too. The head of the corporation met with him and offered him $50,000, which in 1971, that was a lot of money. I mean, it would have covered all of his bills. It would have enabled him to get back on his feet financially. And, he wouldn't hear of it. He felt it was more important that the story get out.
Yeah.
The head of this corporation was doing everything he could to whitewash the story and play up the fact that, like, well, look at all the good that my company is doing with all these wonderful consumer products, and on and on and on he was going.
Yeah.
And Smith was saying, yeah, but like, look what you're doing to the people of this village. And he kept trying to say, oh, well, the toxic chemical levels in the water are well within safety regards. Well, how do you account for these people who are paralyzed and had gnarled limbs and were having memory issues and shaking and blindness, and I mean, all kinds of physical debilitations as a result of drinking the water and eating the fish that came out of the area surrounding the plant? I mean,
That's really bad. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You also said it was a village, right? So
Yes.
village versus like a big corporation, that's always a challenge. Because
Yes. Well, I mean, they probably figured out, well, there's not that many people involved here, so what difference does it make? It's collateral damage, essentially.
mm,
Um, but as I understand it, Minamata has grown quite a bit since then. So I mean, it's something that they have to keep after, because apparently the issues have not gone away completely.
oh,
Even though the government and the courts issued very severe rulings against the corporation,
mm,
they haven't always been, the settlements and the orders have not always been abided by as well as they could have been. So even though Smith made this story known to the world,
yeah.
it's still something that everybody has to keep diligently fighting for, to make sure that issues get taken care of. And I think that's what prompted the montage of the other ecological disasters that are depicted over the closing credits. You know, the fact that it's not just Minamata, it's Fukushima, it's the Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, it's Bhopal in India. I mean, you know, you see all these things from all over the world.
Yeah, that's true. Man, sounds like a real eye-opener. So,
It is.
yeah. How much would you rate this one, Brent?
I would give this one 3.5.
Okay.
Very, very well done. Could have turned down the preachiness a little bit. I think it would have made for a better film.
Right. Right. Well, thank you for that. Let's move to our last movie for today.
Okay, so our last movie is another documentary. This one is a joint production of Lithuania and the US. It's a movie called The Jump. And this tells the story of a Soviet radio operator who was aboard a trawler in 1970 who had been desiring to defect to the US. And he found his opportunity when the trawler was in US waters and moored adjacent to an American Coast Guard ship. He literally leapt for freedom, jumping from the trawler to the deck of the American ship. It brings the idea of leap of faith to life in all its great, all its glory.
Yeah.
So the name of the individual, it was Seamus Kudurka, and he really wanted to enjoy the freedoms of the West. He wanted to get out of the Soviet Union and into a life where he could live more freely. So he jumped onto the deck of this Coast Guard cutter. It was an American ship in American waters. Seemingly, when he asked for asylum, it should have been granted right then and there, no questions asked. Yeah. However, the Coast Guard bureaucracy kind of messed up the decision and said, well, we can't have this. You have to give him back. And they ended up allowing the Soviets to take him back to the Soviet Union, where he was tried and thrown into a gulag. And in the US, there was a tremendous outcry saying, how could you have let this happen? This is not the way asylum works, especially when you're talking an American ship in American waters. I mean, that's just not done. So it ended up going very high up the food chain in the political situation, all the way up to President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And they began lobbying for his release. And the Soviets didn't want to do that. They said, no, this man is guilty of treason. He needs to stay in prison where he is. Yeah. Well, a number of people in the American Lithuanian immigrant community began looking into this further. And very curiously, they found a loophole. As it turns out, Kudurka's mother was born in Brooklyn, in New York City. So because she was born in Brooklyn, that made her an American citizen. Right. By virtue of her being an American citizen, that made him an American citizen. So when they brought that up and presented that to the Soviets, they're like, I guess we have to let him go. So he he ended up immigrating to the US and was finally able to enjoy all the freedoms of being in the West. But it was interesting also in the fact that he waxed somewhat philosophically about all of this, and the fact that he looked around and he saw a lot of Americans who didn't appreciate the freedoms. They didn't appreciate the abundance that they had compared to what he was accustomed to with living in the Soviet Union. So it became almost a sort of mantra for him to try and spread that word to amongst the American people, saying, you really need to be more grateful for what you've got, because you don't know what it's like to not have it until you've lived under circumstances like I did. So over the course of a number of years, they ended up making a made-for-TV movie about his story, and he became sort of a celebrity, appearing on game shows and places like that. I mean, he really was, it was a very interesting story, seeing all of these things come out of this one little incident of leaping from one ship to another. On top of that, Kuderka, who is, I believe, in his late 80s now, he was a very interesting and colorful character on top of it. And he's managed to stay quite vital and vibrant on into his senior years. So that's been another angle that's worked into his notion of developing appreciation and gratitude for what you have in life, because he's been able to live this long and vital life, and he's managed to stay relatively healthy throughout all of it, given everything he's been through. Right. He's really quite a character. So this is a film that really, I think a lot of people would find very inspiring in terms of, you know, see the glass as half full instead of half empty more often.
Right.
Now, the one thing I will have to advise viewers about with finding this film is it might be a little bit hard to come by. This has primarily been playing on the film festival circuit. It's not available for streaming, at least not yet. I wouldn't be surprised if it does become available for streaming, but I haven't seen anything announced yet in terms of when that was going to happen. But if you are in an area where a film festival is taking place, you might want to check out their schedule and see if this will be on it. If it is, I think it's definitely worth seeing.
So how much would you rate this?
I would give this one 3.5 to 4 stars as well. In addition to a number of interviews with people who were involved in the story at the time, it features a tremendous amount of archive footage involving news broadcasts and other filming that was done at the time that this was all playing out. I have to admit, I honestly didn't recall this story unfolding at the time. I don't remember it. So this was a story that has kind of been lost to time. I would have been in my mid-teens when this story took place, but I honestly don't recall or remember much of anything about it from that time. So it was interesting to see this story with all the archive footage, it kind of like a time capsule come to life in many ways. So if you can find it, I would say definitely give it a look. But it will. I think it will take some work.
Yeah, I mean, given that it's a challenge finding some of the other movies sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the other ones are all either in theaters or available for streaming, but this one hasn't been made that widely available just yet.
Right.
I hope it does.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brent. I was also noticing like how we kind of covered like the underlying message in all of these movies, kind of like the moral that they have. That was really nice to see, like how you said this one is about the gratitude, and then even the Pink Cloud was similar, like, you know, the gratitude for everyday life, and like, you know, how you can see the glass half full or half empty. Like, I think every movie pretty much had like an underlying message. That was something.
Yeah. That's one of the things that, you know, I attempt to do with movies with meaning, is the fact that I really am trying to encourage people to look for films that have something to do more than just entertainment value, that they've got something more that you can take away from it and enjoy it, you know, tremendously. And it's interesting that a lot of these came out of the film festival circuit. And I think that's really important to recognize too, because that's really where you're seeing so much of the really best material these days. And to that end, I wanted to add that I'm currently streaming selections from the Milwaukee Film Festival. This is my first time streaming this particular festival. I've already seen 3 films. They've all been terrific. So when I get to my, after seeing everything that I've got scheduled, I'll have a lot to report back on next month in terms of some new films that are worth seeing. Because so far this is turning out to be a terrific selection of films. So I'm looking forward to everything else that this festival has to show.
That's great. And we'll all be looking forward to your picks for next month as well.
And one other thing I'd like to add just before we close, last time we talked about the Oscars and my predictions.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm happy to report that all 6 of my predictions came true.
Yes, I was waiting for that, and I was so happy because I remember Brent mentioned that like he has been a little bit off in last couple of years and it's not been all right. So I was like, okay. But when I saw that everything was right, and even some of the informal predictions that he made about the awards that Dune was going to get, according to him, all of them on point. So great job, Brent.
Well, thank you. If viewers want to read more about my results and what I had to say about them, there's a blog on my webpage where I talked about this. It's titled Perfect Predictions. And it goes into detail about everything that I said and what I felt. And I even got a few things to say in there about Will Smith. So.
Right. Well, they were really perfect predictions this time. So be sure to check that out, everyone. So I think we've reached the end of our show for today, Brent.
Yes, we have. But we'll be back again next month with some more movies and some hopefully another wonderful film festival wrap up. And we'll be heading into summer movie season, so get ready for the blockbusters.
Great. Well, thank you, Brent, and thank you everyone for watching.
Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.